Enneads by Plotinus, 6th Ennead, 2nd Tractate, on Kinds of Being, number 2. Chapter 1. We have examined the proposed 10 genera. We have discussed also the theory which gathers the total of things into one genus, and to this subordinates what may be thought of as its 4 species. The next step is, naturally, to expound our own views, and to try and show the agreement of our conclusions with those of Plato. Now, if we were obliged to consider being as a unity, the following questions would be unnecessary. Is there one genus embracing everything, or are there genera which cannot be subsumed under such a unity? Are there first principles? Are first principles to be identified with genera, or genera with first principles? Or is it perhaps rather the case that while not all genera are first principles, all first principles are at the same time genera? Or is the converse true? Or again, do the classes overlap, some principles being also genera, and some genera also principles? And do both the sets of categories we have been examining imply that only some principles are genera and some genera principles? Or does one of them presuppose that all that belongs to the class of genera belongs also to the class of principles? Since, however, we affirm that being is not a unity, the reason for this affirmation is stated by Plato and others. These questions become imperative. Once we are satisfied as to the number of genera to be posited and the grounds for our choice. The subject of our inquiry, then, is the existent or existent entities, and it presents immediately 2 problems demanding separate analysis. What do we mean by the existent? This is naturally the first question to be examined. What is that which, often taken for being, for the existent, is in our view becoming and never really being? Note, however, that these concepts are not to be taken as distinguished from each other in the sense of belonging to a genus, something divided into being and becoming, and we must not suppose that Plato took this view. It would be absurd to assign being to the same genus as non-being. This would be to make one genus of Socrates and his portrait. The division here between what has being and what is in becoming means a definite marking off, a setting asunder, leading to the assertion that what takes the appearance of being is not being, and implying that the nature of true being has been quite misapprehended. Being, we are taught, must have the attribute of eternity, must be constituted as never to belie its own nature. This, then, is the being of which we shall treat, and in our investigation we shall assume that it is not a unity. Subsequently, we ask leave to say something on the nature of becoming, and on what it is that comes to be, that is, on the nature of the world of sense. Chapter 2. In asserting that being is not a unity, we do not mean to imply a definite number of existences. The number may well be infinite. We mean simply that it is many as well as one. That is, so to speak, a diversified unity, a plurality in unity. It follows that either the unity so regarded is a unity of genus under which the existent entities, involving as they do plurality as well as unity, stand as species, or that while there are more genera than one, yet all are subordinate to a unity, or there may be more genera than one, though no one genus is subordinate to any other, but all with their own subordinates. Whether these be lesser genera or species with individuals for their subordinates, all are elements in one entity, and from their totality, the intellectual realm, that which we know as being, derives its constitution. If this last is the truth, we have here not merely genera, but genera which are at the same time principles of being. They are genera because they have subordinates, other genera, and successively species and individuals. They are also principles, since from this plurality being takes its rise, constituted in its entirety from these, its elements. Suppose, however, a greater number of origins, which by their mere totality comprised, without possessing any subordinates, the whole of being. These would be first principles, but not genera. It would be as if one constructed the sensible world from the four elements, fire and the others. These elements would be first principles, but they would not be genera unless the term genus is to be used equivocally. But does this assertion of certain genera, which are at the same time first principles, imply that by combining the genera, each with its subordinates, we find the whole of being in the resultant combination? But then, taken separately, their existence will not be actual, but only potential, and they will not be found in isolation. Suppose, on the other hand, we ignore the genera and combine the particulars. What then becomes of the ignored genera? They will surely exist in the purity of their own isolation, and the mixtures will not destroy them. The question of how this result is achieved may be postponed. For the moment, we take it as agreed that there are genera as distinct from principles of being, and that on another plane, principles, elements, are opposed to compounds. We are thus obliged to show in what relation we speak of genera, and why we distinguish them instead of summing them under a unity. For otherwise we imply that their coalescence into unity is fortuitous, whereas it would be more plausible to dispense with their separate existence. If all the genera could be species of being, all individuals without exception being immediately subordinate to these species, then such a unification becomes feasible. But that supposition bespeaks annihilation for the genera. The species will no longer be species. Plurality will no longer be subordinated to unity. Everything must be the unity, unless there exists some thing or things outside the unity. The one never becomes many, as the existence of species demands, unless there is something distinct from it. It cannot of itself assume plurality, unless we are to think of it as being broken into pieces like some extended body. But even so, the force which breaks it up must be distinct from it. If it is itself to effect the breaking up, or whatever form the division may take, then it is itself previously divided. For these and many other reasons, we must abstain from positing a single genus, and especially because neither being nor substance can be the predicate of any given thing. If we do predicate being, it is only as an accidental attribute, just as when we predicate whiteness of a substance, we are not predicating the absolute whiteness. Chapter 3. We assert then a plurality of existent entities, but a plurality not fortuitous, and therefore a plurality deriving from a unity. But even admitting this derivation from a unity, however not predicated of them in respect of their essential being, there is surely no reason why each of these existent entities, distinct in character from every other, should not in itself stand as a separate genus. Is then this unity external to the genera thus produced, this unity which is their source, though it cannot be predicated of them in respect of their essence? It is indeed external, the one is beyond. It cannot therefore be included among the genera. It is the transcendent source, while they stand side by side as genera. Yet surely the one must somehow be included among the genera. No, it is the existent entities we are investigating, not that which is beyond existence. We pass on, then, to consider that which is included, and find, to our surprise, the cause included with the things it causes. It is surely strange that the causes and effects should be brought into the same genus. But if the cause is included with its effects only in the sense in which a genus is included with its subordinates, the subordinates being of a different order, so that it cannot be predicated of them whether as their genus or in any other relation, these subordinates are obviously themselves genera with subordinates of their own. You may, for example, be the cause of the operation of walking, but The walking is not subordinate to you in relation of species to genus, and if walking had nothing prior to it as its genus, but had posteriors, then it would be a primary genus and rank among the existent entities. Perhaps, however, it must be utterly denied that unity is even the cause of other things. They should be considered rather as its parts or elements, if the terms may be allowed, their totality constituting a single entity which our thinking divides. All unity though it be, it goes by a wonderful power out into everything. It appears as many and becomes many when there is motion. The fecundity of its nature causes the one to be no longer one, and we, displaying what we call its parts, consider them each as a unity and make them into genera. Unaware of our failure to see the whole at once, we display it then in parts, though unable to restrain their natural tendency to coalescence. We bring these parts together again, resign them to the whole, and allow them to become a unity, or rather to be a unity. All this will become clearer in the light of further consideration, when, that is to say, we have ascertained the number of genera, for thus we shall also discover their causes. It is not enough to deny. We must advance by dint of thought and comprehension. The way is clear. Chapter 4. If we had to ascertain the nature of body, and the place it holds in the universe, surely we should take some sample of body, say stone, and examine into what constituents it may be divided. There would be what we think of as the substrate of stone, its quantity, in this case a magnitude, its quality, for example, the color of stone. As with stone, so with every other body. We should see that in this thing, body, there are three distinguishable characteristics: the pseudo-substance, the quantity, the quality, though they all make one and are only logically trisected, the three being found to constitute the unit thing, body. If motion were equally inherent in its constitution, we should include this as well, and the four would form a unity, the single body depending upon them all for its unity and characteristic nature. The same method must be applied in examining the intellectual substance and the genera and first principles of the intellectual sphere. But we must begin by subtracting what is peculiar to body, its coming to be, its sensible nature, its magnitude, that is to say, the characteristics which produce isolation and mutual separation. It is an intellectual being we have to consider, an authentic existent, possessed of a unity surpassing that of any sensible thing. Now the wonder comes how a unity of this type can be many as well as one. In the case of body, it was easy to concede unity with plurality. The one body is divisible to infinity. Its color is a different thing from its shape, since in fact they are separated. But if we take soul, single, continuous, without extension, of the highest simplicity, as the first effort of the mind makes manifest, how can we expect to find multiplicity here too? We believed that the division of the living being into body and soul was final. Body indeed was manifold, composite, diversified, but in soul we imagined we had found a simplex, and boldly made a halt, supposing that we had come to the limit of our course. Let us examine this soul presented to us from the intellectual realm, as body from the sensible. How is its unity a plurality? How is its plurality a unity? Clearly its unity is not that of a composite formed from diverse elements, but that of a single nature comprising a plurality. This problem attacked and solved, the truth about the genera comprised in being will thereby, as we asserted, be elucidated also. Chapter 5. A first point demanding consideration. Bodies, those, for example, of animals and plants, are each a multiplicity founded on color and shape and magnitude, and on the forms and arrangement of parts. Yet all these elements spring from a unity. Now this unity must be either unity absolute, or some unity less thoroughgoing and complete, but necessarily more complete than that which emerges, so to speak, from the body itself. This will be a unity having more claim to reality than the unity produced from it, for divergence from unity involves a corresponding divergence from reality. Since thus bodies take their rise from unity, but not unity in the sense of a complete unity or unity absolute, for this could never yield discrete plurality, it remains that they should be derived from a unity pluralized. But the creative principle in bodies is soul. Soul, therefore, is a pluralized unity. We then ask whether the plurality here consists of the reason principles of the things of process, or is this unity not something different from the mere sum of these principles? Certainly, soul itself is one reason principle, the chief of the reason principles, and these are its act as it functions in accordance with its essential being. This essential being, on the other hand, is the potentiality of the reason principles. This is the mode in which this unity is a plurality, its plurality being revealed by the effect it has upon the external. But to leave the region of its effect, suppose we take it at the higher non-affecting part of soul. Is not plurality of powers to be found in this part also? The existence of this higher part will, we may presume, be at once conceded. But is this existence to be taken as identical with that of the stone? Surely not. Being in the case of the stone is not being pure and simple, but stone being. So here, soul's being denotes not merely being, but soul being. Is then that being distinct from what else goes to complete the essence or substance of the soul? Is it to be identified with being, the absolute, while to some differentia of being is ascribed the production of soul? No doubt soul is in a sense being, and this is not as a man is white, but from the fact of its being purely an essence. In other words, the being it possesses it holds from no source external to its own essence. Chapter 6. But must it not draw on some source external to its essence, if it is to be conditioned not only by being, but by being an entity of a particular character? But if it is conditioned by a particular character, and this character is external to its essence does not compromise all that which makes it soul. Its individuality will determine it. A part of soul will be essence, but not soul entire. Furthermore, what being will it have when we separate it from its other components? The being of a stone? No. The being must be a form of being appropriate to a source, so to speak, and a first principle, or rather, must take the forms appropriate to all that is comprised in soul's being. The being here must, that is, be life, and the life and the being must be one. One in the sense of being one reason principle? No. It is the substrate of the soul that is one, though one in such a way as to be also two or more, as many as are the primaries which constitute soul. Either then it is life as well as substance, or else it possesses life. But if life is a thing possessed, the essence of the possessor is not inextricably bound up with life. If, on the contrary, this is not possession, the two, life and substance, must be a unity. Soul, then, is one and many as are manifested in that oneness, one in its nature, many in those other things, a single existent. It makes itself many by what we may call its motion. It is one entire, but by striving, so to speak, to contemplate itself, it is a plurality. For we may imagine that it cannot bear to be a single existent, when it has the power to be all that it in fact is. The cause of its appearing as many is this contemplation, and its purpose is the act of the intellect. If it were manifested as a bare unity, it could have no intellection, since in that simplicity it would already be identical with the object of its thought. Chapter 7. What then are the several entities observable in this plurality? We have found substance, essence, and life simultaneously present in soul. Now, this substance is a common property of soul, but life, common to all souls, differs in that it is a property of intellect also. Having thus introduced intellect and its life, we make a single genus of what is common to all life, namely motion. Substance and the motion which constitutes the highest life we must consider as two genera, for, even though they form a unity, they are separable to thought, which finds their unity not a unity, otherwise it could not distinguish them. Observe also, in other things, motion or life is clearly separated from being, a separation impossible, doubtless, in true being, but possible in its shadow and namesake. In the portrait of a man much is left out, and above all the essential thing, life. The being of sensible things, just such a shadow of true being, an abstraction from that being complete which was life in the archetype. It is because of this incompleteness that we are able in the sensible world to separate being from life and life from being. Being, then, containing many species, has but one genus. Motion, however, is to be classed as neither a subordinate nor a supplement of being, but as its concomitant, for we have not found being serving as substrate to motion. Motion is being act. Neither is separated from the other except in thought. The two natures are one, for being is inevitably actual, not potential. No doubt we observe motion and being separately, motion as contained in being, and being as involved in motion, and in the individual they may be mutually exclusive, but the dualism is an affirmation of our thought only, and that thought sees either form as a duality within a unity. Now, motion thus manifested in conjunction with being does not alter being's nature, unless to complete its essential character, and it does not retain forever its own peculiar nature. At once, then, we are forced to introduce stability. To reject stability would be more unreasonable than to reject motion, for stability is associated in our thought and conception with being even more than with motion. Unalterable condition, unchanging mode, single reason principle, these are the characteristics of the higher sphere. Stability, then, may also be taken as a single genus, obviously distinct from motion, and perhaps even its contrary. That it is also distinct from being may be shown by many considerations. We may especially observe that if stability were identical with being, so also would motion be, with equal right. Why identity in the case of stability, and not in that of motion, when motion is virtually the very life and act both of substance and of absolute being? However, on the very same principle on which we separated motion from being, with the understanding that it is the same and not the same, that they are two and yet one, we also separate stability from being, holding it yet inseparable. It is only a logical separation, entailing the inclusion among the existent entities of this other genus. To identify stability with being, with no difference between them, and to identify being with motion, would be to identify stability with motion, through the mediation of being, and so to make motion and stability one and the same thing. Chapter 8. We cannot indeed escape positing these three, being, motion, stability. Once it is the fact that intellect discerns them as separates, and, if it thinks of them at all, it posits them by that very thinking. If they are thought, they exist. Things whose existence is bound up with matter have no being in the intellect. These three principles are, however, free of matter, and in that which goes free of matter, to be thought is to be. We are in the presence of intellect undefiled. Fix it firmly, but not with the eyes of the body. You are looking upon the hearth of reality. Within it, a sleepless light. You see how it holds to itself, and how it puts apart things that were together, how it lives a life that endures and keeps a thought acting not upon any future, but upon that which already is, upon an eternal present, a thought self-centered, bearing on nothing outside of itself. Now in the act of intellect there are energy and motion, in itself intellection, substance and being. In virtue of its being it thinks, and it thinks of itself as being, and of that as being upon which it is, so to speak, pivoted. Not that its act self-directed ranks as substance, but being stands as the goal and origin of that act, the object of its contemplation, though not the contemplation itself, and yet this act too involves being, which is its motive and its term. By the fact that its being is actual and not merely potential, intellect bridges the dualism of agent and patient, and abjures separation. It identifies itself with being, and being with itself. Being, the most firmly said of all things, that in virtue of which all other things receive stability, possesses this stability not as from without, but as springing within, as inherent. Stability is the goal of intellection, a stability which had no beginning, and the state from which intellection was impelled was stability, though stability gave it no impulsion. For motion neither starts from motion nor ends in motion. Again, the form idea has stability, since it is the goal of intellect. Intellection is the form's motion. Thus, all the existent entities are one, at once motion and stability. Motion and stability are genera all-pervading, and every subsequent is a particular being, a particular stability, and a particular motion. We have caught the radiance of being, and beheld it in its three manifestations: being revealed by the being within ourselves, the motion of being revealed by the motion within ourselves, and its stability revealed by ours. We accommodate our being, motion, stability to those of the archetypal, unable, however, to draw any distinction, but finding ourselves in the presence of entities inseparable and, as it were, interfused. We have, however, in a sense, set them a little apart, holding them down and viewing them in isolation, and thus we have observed being, stability, motion, these three, of which each is a unity to itself. In so doing, have we not regarded them as being different from each other? By this posing of three entities, each a unity, we have surely found being to contain difference. Again, inasmuch as we restore them to an all-embracing unity, identifying all with unity, do we not see in this amalgamation identity emerging as a real existent? Thus, in addition to the other three, being, motion, stability, we are obliged to posit the further two, identity and difference, so that we have found all five genera. In doing so, we shall not withhold identity and difference from the subsequence of the intellectual order. The thing of sense has, it is clear, a particular identity and a particular difference, but identity and difference have the generic status independently of the particular. They will, moreover, be primary genera, because nothing can be predicated of them as denoting their essential nature. Nothing, of course, we mean but being, but this being is not their genus, since they cannot be identified with any particular being as such. Similarly, being will not stand as genus to motion or stability, for these also are not its species. Beings, or existent entities, comprise not merely what are to be regarded as species of the genus of being, but also participants in being. On the other hand, being does not participate in the other four principles as its genera. They are not prior to being. They do not even attain to its level. Chapter 9. The above considerations, to which others doubtless might be added, suffice to show that these five are primary genera. But that they are the only primary genera, that there are no others, how can we be confident of this? why do we not add unity to them? Quantity, quality, relation, and all else included by our various forerunners. As for unity, if the term is to mean a unity in which nothing else is present, neither soul nor intellect nor anything else, this can be predicated of nothing, and therefore cannot be a genus. If it denotes the unity present in being, in which case we predicate being of unity, this unity is not primal. Besides, unity containing no differences cannot produce species, and not producing species cannot be a genus. You cannot so much as divide unity. To divide it would be to make it many. Unity, aspiring to be a genus, becomes a plurality and annuls itself. Again, you must add to it to divide it into a species. For there can be no differentiae in unity as there are in substance. The mind accepts differences of being, but differences within unity there cannot be. Every differentia introduces a duality, destroying the unity, for the addition of any one thing always does away with the previous quantity. It may be contended that the unity which is implicit in being and in motion is common to all other things, and that therefore being and unity are inseparable. But we rejected the idea that being is a genus comprising all things on the ground that these things are not beings in the same sense of the absolute being, but beings in another mode. In the same way we assert unity is not a genus, the primary unity having a character distinct from all other unities. Admitted that not everything suffices to produce a genus, it may be urged that there is an absolute or primary unity corresponding to the other primaries. But if being and unity are identified, then since being has already been included among the genera, it is but a name that is introduced in unity. If, however, they are both unity, some principle is implied. If there is anything in addition to this principle, unity is predicated of this added thing. If there is nothing added, the reference is again to that unity predicated of nothing. If, however, the unity referred to is that which accompanies being, we have already decided that it is not unity in the primary sense. But is there any reason why this less complete unity should not still possess primary being, seeing that even its posterior we rank as being, and being in the sense of the primary being? The reason is that the prior of this being cannot itself be being, or else, if the prior is being, this is not primary being, but the prior is unity, therefore unity is not being. Furthermore, unity abstracted from being has no differentiae. Again, even taking it as bound up with being, if it is a consequent of being, then it is a consequent of everything, and therefore the latest of things, but the genus takes priority. If it is simultaneous with being, it is simultaneous with everything, but a genus is not thus simultaneous. If it is prior to being, it is of the nature of a principle, and therefore will belong only to being. But if it serves as principle to being, it is not a genus. If it is not a genus to being, it is equally not a genus of anything else, for that would make being a genus of all other things. In sum, the unity exhibited in being on the one hand approximates to unity absolute, and on the other tends to identify itself with being. Being is a unity in relation to the absolute, is being by virtue of its sequence upon that absolute. It is indeed potentially a plurality, and yet it remains a unity, and rejecting division, refuses thereby to become a genus. Chapter 10. In what sense is the particular manifestation of being a unity? Clearly, insofar as it is one thing, it forfeits its unity. With one and thing, we have already plurality. No species can be a unity in more than an equivocal sense. A species is a plurality, so that the unity here is that of an army or a chorus. The unity of the higher order does not belong to species. Unity is thus ambiguous. not taking the same form in being and in particular beings. It follows that unity is not a genus, for a genus is such that wherever it is affirmed, its opposites cannot also be affirmed. Anything of which unity and its opposites are alike affirmed, and this implies the whole of being, cannot have unity as a genus. Consequently, unity can be affirmed as a genus neither of the primary genera, since the unity of being is as much a plurality as a unity, and none of the other primary genera is a unity to the entire exclusion of plurality, nor of things posterior to being, for these most certainly are a plurality. In fact, no genus with all its items can be a unity, so that unity to become a genus must forfeit its unity. The unit is prior to number, yet number it must be, if it is to be a genus. Again, the unit is a unit from the point of view of number. If it is a unit generically, it will not be a unit in the strict sense. Again, just as the unit appearing in numbers is not regarded as a genus predicated of them, but is thought of as inherent in them, so also unity, though present in being, cannot stand as genus to being, or to the other genera, or to anything whatever. Further, as the simplex must be the principle of the non-simplex, though not its genus, for then the non-simplex too would be simplex, so it stands with unity. If unity is a principle, it cannot be a genus to its subsequents, and therefore cannot be a genus of being or of other things. If it is nevertheless to be a genus, everything of which it is a genus must be taken as a unit, a notion which implies the separation of unity from substance. It will not, therefore, be all-embracing, just as being is not a genus of everything, but only of species, each of which is a being, so too unity will be a genus of species, each of which is a unity. But that raises the question of what difference there is between one thing and another, insofar as they are both units corresponding to the difference between one being and another. Unity, it may be suggested, is divided in its conjunction with being and substance. Being, because it is so divided, is considered a genus, the one genus manifested in many particulars. Why, then, should not unity be similarly a genus, inasmuch as its manifestations are as many as those of substance, and it is divided into many particulars? In the first place, the mere fact that an entity inheres in many things is not enough to make it a genus of those things or of anything else. In a word, a common property need not be a genus. The point inherent in a line is not a genus of lines, or a genus at all, nor again, as we have observed, is the unity latent in numbers a genus either of the numbers or of anything else. Genus demands that the common property of diverse objects involve also differences arising out of its own character, that it form species, and that it belong to the essence of the objects. But what differences can there be in unity? What species does it engender? If it produces the same species as we find in connection with being, it must be identical with being. Only the name will differ, and the term being may well suffice. Chapter 11. We are bound, however, to inquire under what mode unity is contained in being. How is what is termed the dividing affected, especially the dividing of the genera being and unity? Is it the same division, or is it different in the two cases? First, then, in what sense, precisely, is any given particular called and known to be a unity? Secondly, does unity, as used of being, carry the same connotation as in reference to the absolute? Unity is not identical in all things. It has a different significance according as it is applied to the sensible and the intellectual realms. Being, too, of course, comports such a difference. And there is a difference in the unity affirmed among sensible things as compared with each other. The unity is not the same in the cases of chorus, camp, ship, house. There is a difference again as between such discrete things and the continuous. Nevertheless, all are representations of the one exemplar, some quite remote, others more effective. The truer likeness is in the intellectual. Soul is a unity, and still more is intellect a unity, and being a unity. When we predicate being of a particular, do we thereby predicate of it unity? And does the degree of its unity tally with that of its being? Such correspondence is accidental. Unity is not proportionate to being. Less unity need not mean less being. An army or a choir has no less being than a house, though less unity. It would appear, then, that the unity of a particular is related not so much to being as to a standard of perfection. Insofar as the particular attains perfection, so far it is a unity, and the degree of unity depends on this attainment. The particular aspires not simply to being, but to being in perfection. It is this strain towards their perfection that such beings as do not possess unity strive their utmost to achieve it. Things of nature tend by their very nature to coalesce with each other and also to unify each within itself. Their movement is not always from, but towards each other and inwards upon themselves. Souls, moreover, seem to desire always to pass into a unity over and above the unity of their own substance. Unity, in fact, confronts them on two sides. Their origin and their goal alike are unity. From unity they have arisen, and towards unity they strive. Unity is thus identical with goodness. It is the universal standard of perfection. For no being ever came into existence without possessing, from that very moment, an irresistible tendency towards unity. From natural things we turn to the artificial. Every art in all its operation aims at whatsoever unity its capacity and its models permit, though being most achieves unity since it is closer at the start. That is why, in speaking of other entities, we assert the name only. For example, man. When we say one man, we have in mind more than one, and if we affirm unity of him in any other connection, we regard it as supplementary to his essence. But when we speak of being as a whole, we say it is one being, without presuming that it is anything but a unity. We thereby show its close association with goodness. Thus, for being as for the others, unity turns out to be, in some sense, principle and term, not, however, in the same sense as for things of the physical order, a discrepancy leading us to infer that even in unity there are degrees of priority. How, then, do we characterize the unity thus diverse in being? Are we to think of it as a common property seen alike in all its parts? In the first place, the point is common to lines, and yet is not their genus. And this unity we are considering may also be common to numbers and not their genus, though we need hardly say the unity of unity absolute is not that of the numbers, 1, 2, and the rest. Secondly, in being there is nothing to prevent the existence of prior and posterior, simple and composite, but unity, even if it be identical in all manifestations of being, having no differentiae, can produce no species, but producing no species, it cannot be a genus. Chapter 12. Enough upon that side of the question. But how does the perfection, goodness of numbers, lifeless things, depend upon their particular unity, just as all other inanimates find their perfection in their unity? If it should be objected that numbers are simply non-existent, we should point out that our discussion is concerned not with units as such, but with beings as considered from the aspect of their unity. We may again be asked how the point, supposing its independent existence granted, participates in perfection. If the point is chosen as an inanimate object, the question applies to all such objects, but perfection does exist in such things. For example, in a circle, the perfection of the circle will be perfection for the point. It will aspire to this perfection and strive to attain it as far as it can through the circle. But how are the 5 genera to be regarded? Do they form particulars by being broken up into parts? No, the genus exists as a whole in each of the things whose genus it is. But how at that can it remain a unity? The unity of a genus must be considered as a whole in many. Does it exist then only in things participating in it? No, it has an independent existence of its own as well, but this will, no doubt, become clearer as we proceed.